Hi, I'm Scott McLaughlin and I'm going to talk you through these little plastic preparations for string instruments that I've been using and that I'd like to use as part of this potential commission should it come about. They're pretty cool. Hope you like it. You can see here is a small plastic ring with a groove around the edge placed in between two of the cello strings. It sits in there. It can be moved up and down if required. Please ignore the 3D printed bridge, it doesn't really affect the sound. Not radically anyways. So when this is put in place, depends a lot on what position it's in, but what you get Hello, I'm Scott McLaughlin from the University of Leeds. Very sorry I can't be here in person this weekend. I've had some unfortunate passport issues, which will all be resolved soon, but not soon enough. This talk is about notating for contingent materiality in open form works. I'll present a bunch of my own compositions, and before that I'll just ground some of these ideas, the idea of contingent materiality, etc. So my own practice is largely a question of working with acoustic instruments in constrained ways that expose contingency and indeterminacy in performative ways. So these are largely open form works where the instrument speaks back, so to speak, to the player. They explore ways of activating objects or instruments that reveal indeterminacies and then analyze these kind of indeterminacies to find a sweet spot of predictability and composing around these behaviours. It is really a question of physical behaviours of the instruments and sounding phenomena. The pieces tend to be circular and iterative. The instrument behaviour is contingent on the performer action, which is constrained by a score, and the performer action is contingent on the response of the instrument. So the two of them speak to each other, in what Andrew Pickering would refer to as a dance of human and material agencies. As a research process, this circles around ideas of materiality, so exploring materialities of particular instruments and uncovering behaviours and working with them in terms of their perception for the player, more so than for the audience, ensuring that whatever the unstable behaviours are, and it tends to be unstable behaviours for reasons I'll get into in a moment, there can be issues of perception where it can be, for example, instabilities that are happening too quickly or happening outside the range of human physicality to be able to deal with. So something, for example, that requires a cellist to move their fingers in such a way that is just too small for cellist's fingers to do in order to make a difference. This leads to a patterning and predictability. So the piece is constructed out of what patterns arise from the behaviours of the material. The materiality is explored in order to find the behaviours, work out which of these are perceptually practical for the player to work with, and then see what patterns and predictability emerge from those that we can form into a score, particularly emergent types of structures. What's important in this is the idea of metastability as a type of contingency. Metastable vibrational states particularly are those which are not quite the most stable state, but that arise from a particular set of conditions that are generally only achievable performatively. That is, that it's usually not easy to set these conditions up in advance or to instantly jump to these conditions. These are sounding states that arise from the ongoing moment-to-moment processes that are happening. As an example, clarinet multiphonics, or multiphonics on any wind instrument, can be achieved through careful work of the player by choosing specific embouchures, etc., and over time they can learn how to control certain multiphonics or to be able to instantaneously produce them. But equally, there are a huge range of multiphonic type sounds that only arise from the interaction of the player and instrument in a way that is much less predictable. And they can be sustained by the player once they emerge, so the player can put energy into them and keep them going up to a point. And this is the interesting thing for me about this metastability. When the instrument presents the player with this sound, it's up to the player to then support the instrument in doing that. So the research process often involves a large amount of repetition, working through instability and metastability, revealing underlying material structures. These acts of repetition on the player's behalf are the activity that they undertake, the tasks that they undertake, again, constrained and guided by the score, and these tasks take place within an environment of the physical phenomena of the instrument, which in these pieces tends to be unstable or metastable to some extent. So there's a cartographical type of metaphor to this as well, the idea that the player is passing through the environment of the instrument and affecting it as they go. So some of this can be grounded usefully, for me at least, in various theories arising out of new materialisms and other ways of dealing with the material world. One of the most important for me in allowing me to think more productively about this kind of approach was Andrew Pickering's ideas of material agency. Pickering is a philosopher of science who considers the performative ontology of the doing of science, the actual act of the scientist's interaction with their machines and processes. He describes this as a set of, a dance of agency between the human and the material, with emergent resistances and accommodations, so that the two things, the human and the material, are always resisting each other, but also accommodating each other, and that this is a circular model. He describes it as an unfolding. Also, theorists such as Karen Barad, Tim Ingold, Jane Bennett, Lucy Suchman's situated objects, and many others have been very useful for me. And Karen Noor-Satina's ideas of epistemic objects, that is, objects of knowledge that arise often from practice situations, and that these objects of knowledge are bounded but infinitely expanding. She describes it thus: objects of knowledge appear to have the capacity to unfold indefinitely. They are more like open drawers filled with folders extending indefinitely into the depth of a dark closet. Since epistemic objects are always in the process of being materially defined, they continually acquire new properties and change the ones they have. But this also means that objects of knowledge can never be fully attained, that they are, if you wish, never quite themselves. This, for me, is a very productive idea when dealing with these kind of unstable sound worlds, that a scratch tone is not simply a scratch tone, that a scratch tone contains potentially an infinity of unfolding layers and layers and layers that can always be, because they are being materially defined constantly and in a dynamic way as an interaction with the player, there's always other surprises to find in there. So this brings us back to the question of notation and notating for materiality. Since materiality is so central to my entire compositional practice, the question of notation has always been a little bit vexed for me. And the examples I'm going to go through now span the range from prose-based scores through to quasi-tablature and quasi-graphic notations. Somewhere along the way, I think I would rather just tell the player what to do and then let the human and material agency allow the piece to emerge from that. But it doesn't always work out that way, and situations don't always allow for that kind of long-term, deep engagement with the piece. And we'll see that coming up in some of these examples. I find it helpful to think of notation as existing in a continuum between representational and performative ontologies. That there are, for example, ways of notating in which representation is important, and this representation is then taken into the performance practice of the player. For example, a notated middle C for someone playing Schubert means something slightly different to a notated middle C to someone playing, well, even Schumann, but someone playing perhaps 20th century or 21st century works. The performance context is an interpretive layer that is then added onto the representation, of the notation. The notation is an object that is taken into the performance practice and also taken into the player's interpretation. Performative ontologies, on the other hand, of course, there is still the question of interpretation, but like graphic type approaches to notation or quasi-graphic approaches, these can allow a more dynamic interaction. If perhaps even more dynamic is creating an unfair binary that doesn't really exist, but that the nature of the interaction with that notation is less symbolic and more to do with the continuous unfolding of analogues between the visual nature of that notation and the sonic nature of what's being played. Or, if not necessarily the sonic nature of what's being played, then certainly the way to play it. So in my own works, the first piece I'll talk about is a metastable harmony, which is a string quartet written in 2012. In this piece, the players use a drone bowing technique which allows individual partials to emerge. So as the player continuously bows an open string, they move the bow around into different positions gently and gradually until the spectrum of that string collapses and a single strong partial emerges. Each string has its own preferential hierarchy of partials. So if I bow my C string today, it might be the fifth partial that wants to come out. If I come back to it in an hour, changes to environment or the instrument might mean that the seventh partial wants to come out. This is my experience of it. So in order to deal with this constraint, I went into this piece with an effort stave. The effort stave goes from low to high, defines at its lowest point the minimal effort, so when you just continuously bow, what harmonic comes out. And that's that goal reached. As you move up through the effort stave, the player is supposed to try and move past these more obvious partials and try and bring out higher, less stable ones, up to a ceiling where there's still some stability and the sound isn't completely collapsing. This was moderately successful in that the piece sounds pretty good. I'm happy with the piece. It does take a lot of involvement from the players to get to understand this way of bowing and to just get used to bringing out these kinds of sounds and dealing with it in this notational capacity. Arguably, what this achieves best is that it allows for a more strict approach to time than more open form works. So while this is open form on a moment-to-moment basis, with this time-space type of notation, there is a strict structure built around it. But it does respond to the materiality. The second piece I'm going to talk about is a solo cello piece that came out of this called Intra-Actions. Intra-Actions uses the same drone bowing technique but attempts to put it into a single instrument using pitch matching as a structural technique. The notation here just uses a prose score which describes what the player is supposed to do in the form of conditional statements. This is the score that the player sees. Another way of looking at it is to present the score like this. So the player is bowing a string, they attempt to meet condition 1. Once that condition is met, they move on to condition 2, and that condition 2 either sends them back to the start or asks them to retune that string to change the preferences of that string to increase, well, possibly not increase, to alter the possibilities that a partial will match between this note and the previous note. Essentially then the piece goes on in an open form manner until the instrument is so detuned that it can't make sound anymore and can't be played. So in this way, it's strongly driven by the materiality of the instrument. The constraining score limits the player in terms of the actions they can take, but still gives them an awful lot of leeway in terms of interacting with the instrument, even though the instrument is leading them. Coming a little bit more up to date, in 2017 I wrote the string quartet, The Careful Plaiting of Weak Ties. Here again I was in a situation where I didn't feel I could be quite as open form because the piece had limits on duration, etc. And more importantly, because I didn't have an awful lot of rehearsal time with the quartet, so I had to come up with something that was relatively straightforward to get their heads around. So the notation for this piece defines two types of material. The first type is deceptively simply notated. Arguably, these are both types of tablature notation. The first one, while it's notated on standard stave notation, is indicating harmonic positions on particular strings. However, the intention is that the player's human agency is subservient to the material agency of the instrument. What's really being defined here is a set of finger movements, not specifically positions, but movements, and that through these very, very slow glissandi that they make, which should really be as slow as possible, this allows stable harmonics to emerge between these points. So what you really have here is a set of stable points and then a set of movements, and those movements are opportunities for the material agency of the instrument to speak out. The player's job here is to support whatever harmonics the instrument wants to play. The reason for the specific positions is just to set up some harmony across the four instruments, so there are some notes, well, harmonics, that come up in all the instruments. The second set of material is also so tablatural. You can see from the left-hand side that there is at the top line, the instrument bridge, and then at the bottom there's a preparation. And this is the space between the preparation and the bridge. So the player is moving the bow, traversing this space, and following the thickness of the line performatively. Now, no time domain is given here at all. Again, the point being that the player bows in this manner, and the thickness of the line refers to force or energy. So the thicker line is a fairly strong bow stroke, whereas a thin line is slow, very light, etc. But these are not defined too specifically. The point being, again, like with the first type of material, that the player is instructed to bow in this way, but their job is to support what the instrument wants to bring out. And in some ways, this is a defeat tactic, in that the notation is there to give the player something to do. I don't mean that quite as flippantly as it sounds. The notation is there to give the player some motions to make and to allow them to concentrate then on allowing the instrument to speak. So with few rehearsals, this type of notation allowed the players to get into the idea of working with these unstable sounds, and also that their way of playing these particular lines had to do with what the instrument wanted to do. So it was all about them using these as tools to explore. In a later piece that I'm working on at the moment with a student ensemble, I've expanded this a little bit. So although there is a bass clef there, you can ignore that bass clef. The 6 lines that are given there are now 6 positions between the preparation and the bridge. And this is partially to create some more ambiguity. Rather than specifying a kind of middle or end, I found that when I was playing with these preparations, playing either very near the bridge or very near the preparation were quite specific. They would give quite specific responses, whereas in between there was quite a lot of variability possible. So this is to give the player a little bit more leeway to respond to the instrument. In terms of future directions, as I mentioned before, I don't feel like I have cracked this particular problem. I don't really know whether I need notation. Certainly the practicalities of having to work quickly with a player makes notation useful, but I suspect that I'll continue to move between quasi-graphic approaches to notation that give the player the idea of how they should approach this, or also prose approaches which allow me to define in more detail what the player is trying to do and allow the response of the instrument some more agency in controlling the shape of the piece. Thank you.